People think fire destroys the truth, but sometimes smoke is the only witness willing to tell it. The first thing I noticed was not the flashing red lights or the firefighters moving with quiet precision across what had once been my front yard. It was the smell. Wet ash mixed with burned pine, melted insulation, and the faint scent of rain drifting through the cool night air. That smell settled into my clothes the moment I stepped out of my truck. And even now I can remember it more clearly than I remember the sound of anyone speaking. My name is Marcus Ellington, and until that night, the house standing at the end of Willow Creek Lane had been the only home my family had ever known. My parents bought the property more than 40 years earlier when the neighborhood was still surrounded by open fields instead of perfectly trimmed fences and decorative stone entrances. Every room carried memories that could never be replaced. The old oak tree beside the driveway had been planted by my father the summer I turned 10. The wooden bench beneath its branches was built with his own hands after he retired. My mother spent every spring filling the flower beds with bright colors that somehow made the entire street feel warmer. Now all of it stood behind yellow safety tape, while steam drifted slowly into the night sky. Fire investigators photographed every angle of the property with careful patience, their camera shutters clicking steadily through the silence as neighbors gathered across the street in small groups, whispering to one another without ever looking directly at me. I understood why. No one knew what to say to a man watching his family's history disappear beneath layers of blackened wood and soaked debris. I walked toward the temporary barrier until one of the investigators greeted me with calm professionalism, explaining that the examination would continue through the night before anyone could enter the property. I thanked him quietly and stepped back. Anger would accomplish nothing. The facts deserved time to reveal themselves. That was when I noticed Victoria Whitmore standing beneath a street lamp only a few yards away. Even from a distance, she looked exactly as she always did during homeowners association meetings, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who believed every situation could be managed through authority alone. She slowly approached me with an expression carefully balanced between sympathy and control. She told me how sorry she was that such a terrible accident had happened. She said the entire neighborhood would surely come together during such a difficult time. Her voice sounded gentle, but something inside me refused to believe the performance. It was not what she said. It was the timing. Only 48 hours earlier, she had warned me that continued disputes with the homeowners association could eventually leave me with difficult consequences. Standing there beneath the flashing emergency lights, those words echoed louder than the fire engines surrounding us. I looked past her toward the remains of my home and noticed one small section of the foundation that appeared strangely untouched despite everything around it. I could not explain why that detail caught my attention, but I remember thinking that some things survive for a reason. Victoria followed my eyes for only a second before quietly wishing me the best and walking back toward the waiting board members. She believed the hardest chapter of my life had already been written. She had no idea the story was only beginning, and neither of us yet understood that the truth had already survived the fire. Before anyone blamed the fire, before investigators marked the ground with numbered evidence flags, before neighbors whispered theories across freshly cut lawns, the real story had already been unfolding for nearly 2 years. I have always believed that a house is more than lumber, concrete, and paint. A house remembers birthdays, family dinners, late-night conversations, and quiet mornings when sunlight slips across the kitchen table exactly the same way it did the day before. My parents understood that long before I did. They purchased our home in Willow Creek Estates when the neighborhood was still growing, planting the old oak tree beside the driveway with the same confidence they used to build every part of our family's future. After they passed away, I stayed because leaving never felt right. Every room carried a piece of them, from my mother's handwritten recipes tucked inside a kitchen drawer to my father's handcrafted wooden bench resting beneath the spreading branches outside. Most evenings were peaceful. I would return from the courthouse after finishing my judicial responsibilities, change into ordinary clothes, and spend an hour tending the flower beds or reading beneath the oak tree. Almost nobody in the neighborhood knew where I worked. I preferred it that way. My profession belonged inside the courthouse, not at neighborhood barbecues or homeowners association meetings. That quiet routine changed the afternoon Victoria Whitmore became president of the homeowners association. At first, Nothing seemed unusual. She introduced herself with polished confidence, speaking about protecting property values, preserving community standards, and strengthening neighborhood pride. Many homeowners applauded her enthusiasm. I did too. It seemed like the beginning of responsible leadership. Then the certified letters started arriving. The first one claimed the trim around my garage required repainting, even though it matched the approved color listed in the association guidelines. A week later, another notice questioned the placement of decorative planters that had remained unchanged for years. Soon there were comments about my mailbox, the edging around the driveway, the height of ornamental shrubs, and the angle of a porch light that somehow no longer reflected community expectations. Every notice carried strict deadlines, official language, and the unmistakable signature of Victoria Whitmore. I responded the same way every single time. I corrected anything that genuinely required attention, documented the condition of my property with dated photographs, and filed every letter inside a gray metal cabinet standing in the corner of my home office. My father used to say that memories belong in photo albums, but facts belong in folders because one day someone may need to prove what really happened. I never imagined how valuable that advice would become. As the months passed, neighbors quietly admitted they rarely received notices unless they openly disagreed with Victoria during association meetings. Some laughed it off. Others stopped attending altogether. I chose a different approach. I listened more than I spoke, preserved every document, and refused to let frustration replace patience. Victoria interpreted my silence as weakness. She believed each new violation notice pushed me closer to surrender. She never realized that every envelope she mailed, every inspection she approved, and every signature she placed on official correspondence quietly strengthened a record that would eventually tell a far more complete story than either of us could see at the time. The letters became so predictable that I could almost tell which Fridays would end with another certified envelope waiting inside my mailbox. They always arrived just before the weekend, giving me 2 full days to think about another alleged violation before anyone at the Homeowners Association office answered the telephone again. I never opened those envelopes immediately. Instead, I carried each one into my home office, photographed the sealed package beside that day's newspaper to document the date, and placed it on my desk before carefully reading every page. The complaints grew stranger with each passing month. One notice claimed the border around my flower beds no longer reflected the approved community appearance, even though it had not changed since my parents planted them years earlier. Another insisted that the decorative lantern beside my front door created inconsistent exterior lighting. A third questioned the placement of my garbage containers, even though they had been stored exactly where the community handbook instructed homeowners to keep them. Individually, none of the accusations seemed important. Together, they formed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. The monthly Homeowners Association meetings followed that same pattern. Victoria Whitmore always arrived carrying a perfectly organized binder filled with neatly labeled tabs and printed reports. She spoke with polished confidence, reminding residents that strict enforcement protected property values and preserved the neighborhood's reputation. Most homeowners nodded politely. A few quietly avoided eye contact altogether. During one meeting, a retired couple asked why similar landscaping issues appeared to receive different treatment depending on the homeowner. Victoria smiled without raising her voice and explained that every situation was unique and required individual evaluation. The room fell silent almost immediately. Nobody challenged the answer. As people gathered their belongings afterward, I noticed several neighbors speaking only after they stepped into the parking lot, lowering their voices as though ordinary questions had somehow become dangerous inside the meeting room. That silence told me far more than any official minutes ever could. I continued doing exactly what I had done from the beginning. Every notice received its own folder. Every email was printed and backed up digitally. Every inspection date was matched with photographs taken the very same afternoon. I even requested copies of publicly available meeting records whenever they were released, adding them to the growing timeline inside the gray filing cabinet. My father often reminded me that facts become stronger when they are organized before anyone realizes they will matter. His words echoed every time I heard the smooth metallic click of the cabinet drawer closing. One cool October afternoon, I returned home to find Victoria standing near my driveway with a clipboard tucked beneath her arm. The crisp breeze carried the scent of dry leaves while the old oak tree scattered golden branches across the lawn. She greeted me pleasantly and explained that she was conducting routine neighborhood observations. I thanked her, wished her a pleasant afternoon, and walked inside without another question. 3 days later, another certified letter arrived describing conditions that supposedly required immediate correction, including several details I had photographed only hours after our brief conversation. Looking at those photographs beside the official notice, I realized something that changed the way I viewed every interaction from that point forward. These inspections were no longer random administrative reviews. Someone had already decided what the outcome would be before the paperwork was ever created. Victoria believed every new signature strengthened her authority over my future. She never considered that every signature also strengthened the story my evidence was quietly preparing to tell when the right courtroom finally entered the picture. By the beginning of the second year, the routine had become almost mechanical. Every inspection notice, every committee email, every certified letter, and every meeting agenda followed a rhythm so consistent that I could nearly predict what would happen before it did. I stopped viewing each incident as a separate disagreement and began seeing them as connected pieces of a much larger picture. One Saturday morning, while trimming the shrubs along my driveway, I noticed Victoria Whitmore slowly driving through the neighborhood with another board member seated beside her. Their vehicle moved well below the posted speed limit, pausing briefly in front of certain homes before continuing down the street. When they reached my property, the vehicle remained parked at the curb for nearly a full minute. Victoria looked toward my yard, made several notes on a clipboard, then quietly drove away without saying a word. I returned to my work, finished trimming the hedges, photographed the completed landscaping from several angles, and stored the images in the same organized folders that had grown steadily over the previous months. 4 days later, another certified envelope arrived. According to the notice, my shrubs exceeded the permitted height and required immediate correction within 10 business days. I compared the inspection date with the photographs already stored on my computer and quietly smiled. The timestamp on my camera showed that the shrubs had measured well within the published community standards on the very afternoon Victoria recorded her observations. Instead of sending an emotional response, I simply requested the inspection records through the procedures available to every homeowner. The reply included photographs taken from unusually narrow angles that exaggerated the appearance of the landscaping while omitting the measurement markers referenced in the written report. I added those documents to the growing collection inside my gray filing cabinet without making a single accusation. Around the same time, Daniel Brooks, my next-door neighbor, stopped by one evening carrying 2 cups of coffee. We sat beneath the old oak tree while a cool breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass through the neighborhood. After several minutes of ordinary conversation, he quietly admitted that he had started noticing the same pattern affecting other residents. Homeowners who questioned board decisions often received repeated inspections within days, while obvious violations at other properties seemed to disappear without explanation. Daniel offered to write a statement if I ever needed one. I thanked him sincerely but told him there was no need to rush. The truth becomes stronger when people speak because they choose to, not because they are asked. As autumn settled over Willow Creek Estates, more folders filled the filing cabinet. Inspection reports matched photographs. Emails matched meeting minutes. Certified receipts matched official correspondence. Without realizing it, Victoria had created an almost perfect administrative timeline through her own paperwork. She believed quantity created credibility. I understood that consistency created something far more valuable. Every document she approved carried a date. Every decision left a record. Every signature connected another piece of the story. Standing in my home office one evening, I slowly closed the cabinet drawer and rested my hand on the smooth metal handle for a moment. My father had once told me that patience is easiest to underestimate because it rarely announces itself. Looking back now, I realized those quiet months were never about surviving endless violation notices. They were about allowing someone convinced of her own authority to build the very record that would eventually force every assumption to answer to documented fact. The night of the fire arrived without warning, wrapped inside an evening so ordinary that nothing about it suggested my life was about to divide itself into a before and an after. I had stayed at the courthouse later than usual, finishing administrative work before beginning the drive home. The sun had already disappeared beyond the western tree line, leaving behind a deep blue sky where the first stars had begun to appear. Soft jazz played through my truck speakers while the familiar route carried me toward Willow Creek Estates. About 15 minutes from home, my phone vibrated several times in quick succession. 3 missed calls from Daniel Brooks appeared on the screen, followed almost immediately by a short voicemail. His voice sounded unusually tense but controlled. "Marcus, you need to get here as soon as you can. There has been a fire." My stomach tightened, and every mile suddenly felt twice as long. As I turned onto the boulevard leading into the neighborhood, flashing emergency lights reflected across parked cars and nearby windows long before I reached my street. The air changed first. Even with my windows closed, I could smell damp smoke mixed with soaked lumber and wet earth drifting across the neighborhood. By the time I parked several houses away, firefighters were completing the final stages of their work, while thin streams of steam continued rising into the cool night air. I walked toward the temporary barrier without speaking, my footsteps crunching softly across gravel scattered by emergency vehicles. The house where my parents had built an entire lifetime of memories was no longer recognizable. The front porch had collapsed into blackened beams. The flower beds my mother cared for every spring had become dark patches beneath layers of soaked ash. The wooden bench my father built beneath the old oak tree had disappeared completely, yet the oak itself remained standing, scarred along one side, but firmly rooted in the same ground where he planted it decades earlier. One of the fire investigators introduced himself with calm professionalism and explained that the property had been secured as part of an active investigation. He assured me that every section of the scene would be carefully photographed and documented before anything was moved. I thanked him and stepped aside, understanding that the search for facts had to begin before emotions could take over. Across the street, Victoria Whitmore stood with 2 members of the Homeowners Association board beneath the glow of a street lamp. When she noticed me, she slowly walked over with carefully measured sympathy, telling me how deeply saddened she was by such an unfortunate tragedy. She added that difficult circumstances sometimes open the door to new beginnings, especially when people accepted that life moved forward. I listened without interrupting, but her words felt strangely rehearsed against the backdrop of flashing emergency lights. As she returned to the sidewalk, one of the investigators approached me again and explained that his team had recovered a small fire-resistant lockbox from a protected section of the foundation. After documenting its location and condition as part of the investigation, they were releasing it into my custody because it appeared to contain personal family records rather than evidence requiring laboratory examination. The soot-covered metal case felt surprisingly heavy in my hands, and although its exterior carried scratches from the fire, the locking mechanism remained intact. I thanked the investigator, placed the unopened lockbox carefully inside my truck, and looked back one final time at the quiet silhouette of the old oak tree. Victoria watched me leave with complete confidence, believing the fire had destroyed everything that truly mattered. Neither of us realized that the one object carried away from those ashes would preserve the very truth she never expected to survive. The days after the fire unfolded with a strange sense of order that almost felt unnatural. I rented a small furnished apartment about 12 miles from Willow Creek Estates, close enough to meet investigators whenever they requested additional information, but far enough away that I could think without constantly staring at the empty space where my family's home had once stood. Every evening after leaving the courthouse, I returned to the apartment, loosened my tie, and spread documents across the dining table until nearly midnight. The gray filing cabinet had not survived the fire, but almost every important record inside it had. Months earlier, I had developed the habit of creating secure digital copies of every certified letter, inspection report, meeting agenda, and email correspondence. Those files now filled my laptop screen in perfectly organized folders, each one arranged by date, until the entire conflict resembled a timeline rather than a collection of isolated disagreements. The fire-resistant lockbox recovered from the property contained everything my father believed should never be left to chance. Family deeds, insurance records, handwritten notes, external storage drives, and the small wooden gavel he had received decades earlier while mentoring young attorneys rested inside exactly as he had arranged them. I lifted the gavel for a quiet moment, remembering his favorite lesson that patience is never passive because every honest decision made today becomes tomorrow's strongest evidence. Outside the apartment window, steady rain tapped softly against the glass while I continued matching inspection notices with photographs, meeting minutes with email chains, and delivery confirmations with official correspondence. The pattern became even clearer now that every document sat together in chronological order. No single letter proved anything on its own, but together they revealed consistent enforcement directed toward one homeowner while similar situations elsewhere received little attention. Daniel Brooks called several times over the following weeks with updates from the neighborhood. According to him, Victoria Whitmore continued speaking confidently during homeowners association meetings, describing the burned property as an unfortunate situation that would eventually allow the community to move forward. She reportedly suggested discussing the future of the vacant lot once pending legal matters concluded. Hearing those comments did not make me angry. They confirmed something much more important. She still believed appearances would control the outcome because she had never seen the complete record quietly waiting behind every ordinary piece of paper she had signed. 3 weeks after the fire, a certified envelope arrived at my temporary address bearing the seal of the county courthouse. The Homeowners Association had filed a civil action concerning ongoing covenant enforcement, outstanding assessments, and additional property-related obligations despite the destruction of the residence. I read every page carefully before placing the documents inside my leather briefcase beside the evidence timeline I had spent months assembling. Nothing in the filing surprised me. In many ways, it simply accelerated the direction this conflict had always been moving. The case was assigned according to standard court procedures, completely separate from my own judicial responsibilities, exactly as professional ethics required. Victoria still believed she would soon face an ordinary homeowner struggling to defend himself against an organization with greater influence and resources. She had spent nearly 2 years forming that assumption without ever asking a simple question about the quiet man who left his house before sunrise carrying a briefcase every morning. She would soon discover that while assumptions can shape confidence, they have no place inside a courtroom where only verified facts, properly presented evidence, and the rule of law determine how a story truly ends. The courthouse always sounded different before the first hearing of the morning. The steady rhythm of polished shoes crossing marble floors blended with quiet conversations between attorneys reviewing case files, while court clerks organized calendars behind the clerk's office windows. I arrived through the judicial entrance shortly before 8 o'clock, carrying the same leather briefcase I had carried every workday for years. My morning routine never changed. I reviewed the docket assigned to my courtroom, met briefly with my courtroom deputy regarding scheduling matters, and confirmed that every case had been assigned according to established judicial procedures. My own civil dispute involving the Homeowners Association had already been transferred months earlier to another judge within the same courthouse under the standard rules governing judicial ethics. That separation protected the integrity of the process, and I would never have accepted anything less. After finishing the administrative matters scheduled before the first session, I adjusted my judicial robe, collected the files for the morning calendar, and walked toward the courtroom. As the heavy wooden doors opened, the courtroom deputy announced, "All rise." The familiar sound of chairs sliding backward echoed softly through the room as everyone stood. I acknowledged the courtroom with a slight nod before taking my seat behind the bench. The morning calendar proceeded exactly as expected. Attorneys presented arguments with measured professionalism. Witnesses answered questions. Court reporters preserved every word. Nothing about those proceedings felt unusual, because that quiet discipline had become part of my daily life long before anyone in Willow Creek Estates knew my name. During a brief recess, I stepped into the hallway outside my courtroom where several attorneys, litigants, and visitors waited for their scheduled proceedings. Across the corridor, I noticed Victoria Whitmore standing beside her attorney while reviewing the electronic docket display listing courtroom assignments. She looked composed at first, scanning the schedule for the civil action involving the Homeowners Association. A courtroom deputy politely directed her attorney toward the correct courtroom on another floor, explaining that the assigned judge would begin the civil calendar shortly. As they turned to leave, The doors behind me opened, and another courtroom deputy respectfully addressed me before escorting me back inside for the next scheduled matter. Victoria instinctively glanced toward the movement, and our eyes met for the first time since the night of the fire. The recognition arrived almost immediately. I watched the confidence leave her expression in quiet stages. First came confusion as she looked from the judicial robe to my face. Then disbelief as she glanced back toward the courtroom entrance where my name appeared beside the judicial assignment. Finally came the realization that the quiet homeowner she had spent nearly 2 years underestimating had never hidden behind deception. She had simply never cared enough to learn who I actually was beyond the assumptions she had already made. Her attorney quietly explained that my judicial responsibilities had absolutely no connection to the separate civil proceeding because another judge had been assigned in full compliance with court ethics, but the explanation no longer mattered. The revelation had already changed something far deeper than the legal strategy prepared for that morning. Throughout every inspection notice, every compliance hearing, every certified letter, and every conversation beneath the old oak tree, Victoria had mistaken silence for weakness and humility for surrender. Standing there inside the courthouse, she finally understood that genuine authority does not announce itself at neighborhood meetings or seek validation through intimidation. It simply appears when duty requires it, speaks only when necessary, and allows the truth to arrive on its own schedule. The civil hearing began 2 mornings later in a courtroom 1 floor below mine, presided over by a judge who had no personal connection to either party and who had been assigned the case under the court's normal procedures. I entered through the public hallway carrying the same leather briefcase that had followed me into every homeowners association meeting over the past 2 years. This time, however, it contained something very different from frustration. It contained order. Victoria Whitmore sat beside her attorney with several neatly arranged binders spread across the counsel table. Although she appeared composed, the confidence that had once defined every movement was noticeably quieter than before. The unexpected encounter at the courthouse had forced her to reconsider assumptions she had carried for years, but assumptions, whether accurate or mistaken, would not matter inside that courtroom. Only evidence would. After opening statements concluded, the Homeowners Association presented its position first. Their attorney argued that repeated covenant violations, unresolved assessments, and continuing compliance issues justified the association's actions concerning my property. The presentation relied heavily upon inspection reports, board resolutions, certified notices, and correspondence accumulated over many months. When the association finished, my attorney stood and approached the lectern with a single organized binder before gradually introducing the complete timeline we had assembled long before the fire. One exhibit led naturally to the next. Certified mailing receipts matched the dates on every notice. High-resolution photographs taken on those same afternoons documented the actual condition of my property. Publicly available meeting minutes demonstrated how discussions repeatedly centered on my home, while nearly identical situations elsewhere received little or no enforcement. Email correspondence established the sequence of communication between the board and homeowners. Inspection reports were compared with photographs bearing verified timestamps. None of those documents relied upon opinion. They simply existed exactly as they had been created. The fire investigation then became part of the record through testimony from the lead investigator, who carefully explained that the examination had been conducted according to established procedures and that the investigation remained separate from the civil dispute before the court. He described only verified observations, confirmed the documented recovery of the fire-resistant lockbox, and explained that certain investigative findings had been referred through the appropriate legal channels without offering speculation beyond the official record. Additional evidence included security camera recordings voluntarily provided by several nearby homeowners. The footage established a detailed timeline of vehicle movement, neighborhood activity, and environmental conditions during the hours surrounding the incident. Standing alone, each recording revealed only a small portion of the evening. Viewed together alongside witness statements, communication records, and documented inspection history, they created a consistent sequence that neither exaggerated nor omitted important facts. Throughout the hearing, I answered every question directed to me with the same calm professionalism I had maintained since receiving the first certified letter years earlier. There was no need to raise my voice because the documents already carried their own weight. As additional exhibits appeared on the courtroom monitors, I noticed Victoria occasionally studying familiar signatures appearing beneath board decisions she had personally approved. Those signatures once represented unquestioned authority within the neighborhood. Now they simply identified the origin of records whose accuracy could be examined alongside every related document. By the conclusion of closing arguments, the discussion had moved far beyond landscaping standards and neighborhood regulations. The courtroom had become a place where careful documentation outweighed confident assumptions, where consistency mattered more than appearances, and where every ordinary piece of paper preserved over 2 patient years quietly fulfilled the purpose my father always believed honest records were meant to serve. Several weeks after the hearing, the court issued its written decision, and the result carried the quiet certainty that only carefully examined facts can provide. The Homeowners Association's claims against my property were rejected after the court determined that the evidence demonstrated inconsistent enforcement of community standards and unsupported administrative actions that could not justify the relief being requested. Separate matters identified during the proceedings remained with the appropriate authorities for independent review under established legal procedures, exactly where they belonged. No dramatic announcements followed. No raised voices filled the courthouse. The written order simply reflected what the evidence had shown from the very beginning. Truth had finally been given the same opportunity to speak that assumptions had enjoyed for nearly 2 years. The effects inside Willow Creek Estates appeared gradually over the months that followed. Temporary leadership replaced the previous Homeowners Association board while new elections were conducted according to the governing documents. Updated enforcement policies required greater transparency, consistent documentation, and equal treatment for every homeowner regardless of personal relationships or previous disagreements. Residents who had once avoided meetings slowly returned, asking thoughtful questions without lowering their voices or looking over their shoulders. Daniel Brooks called one evening with a quiet laugh in his voice and told me something I had not heard in a very long time. Children were riding bicycles through the neighborhood again, while neighbors gathered outside after dinner simply to talk. The atmosphere no longer felt controlled by fear or uncertainty. It finally felt like the community my parents believed they had joined decades earlier. Construction on my new home began the following spring. Every morning, the sound of hammers, saws, and friendly conversation replaced the silence that had settled over the property after the fire. Fresh lumber carried the clean scent of new beginnings, and sunlight reflected from newly framed walls where blackened beams had once stood. I asked the builders to preserve one thing exactly as it had always been. The old oak tree remained beside the driveway, its weathered trunk still bearing the scar left by the fire, yet standing as firmly as ever. Beneath its branches, local craftsmen built a new wooden bench using photographs and measurements preserved inside the fire-resistant lockbox. When they placed the finished bench beneath the tree, I rested my hand across the smooth wood and remembered my father's words that real strength is measured by what remains faithful after hardship, not by what appears perfect before it. On the evening I finally moved back into the completed house, I opened the fire-resistant lockbox one last time before placing it on a shelf inside my home office. The family records remained safely preserved. The digital backups that had protected years of careful documentation remained untouched. Resting beside them was my father's small wooden gavel. I picked it up for only a moment before returning it to its place, understanding that its greatest value had never been the wood itself, but the lesson it represented. Authority without integrity eventually weakens beneath its own weight. Patience supported by evidence grows stronger with time. Looking through the front window toward the old oak tree, I watched. Neighbors waved to one another beneath the evening sky, while children laughed somewhere farther down the street. My house had been rebuilt, but the greatest restoration had never been the walls around me. It was the return of trust, fairness, and quiet confidence that justice does not require anger to prevail. It simply requires honest people willing to preserve the truth until the moment the law is finally ready to hear it.